I pulled up to the house to pick up my daughter for the weekend, only to find the front door deadbolted from the inside. I ended up hopping the neighbor's fence, dropping down into the backyard, and what I saw there quite literally knocked the legs out from under me. My 8-year-old daughter, Chloe, was sitting inside a heavy-duty steel dog crate in the middle of the yard. No food, no water. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and there were deep, angry red grooves carved into her wrists from where wire had bitten into her skin. When I finally snapped the padlock, she lunged at me, her fingernails digging into my forearm so hard they drew blood. She pressed her face into my shirt and whispered exactly one sentence: "Dad, just don't look in the pool." And in that fraction of a second, I knew that the most terrifying thing in this yard wasn't the cage. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. What do you think I found at the bottom of that water? Drop your guess in the comments right now, and let's see if you're right by the end of this. I'll only say this: I thought I was prepared for the absolute worst, but what was resting on the bottom of that pool was infinitely darker than anything my mind could conjure. And it wasn't because it was what you're probably picturing right now. It was something else entirely. Do me a favor and hit the like button so this story reaches the people who need to hear it. Now let's keep going. There is a specific kind of dread that you can't really put into words. It happens when you call your kid and nobody answers. The first time it rings out, you tell yourself the phone is just on the charger. The second time, you figure they're out playing in the yard. By the third time, you start inventing excuses, and each one sounds a little more hollow than the last. But by the fourth time, the thinking stops. You just grab your keys, get in the car, and drive. Because something deep inside your chest pulls tight like a piano wire, and you know with absolute certainty that if you don't leave right this second, that wire is going to snap, and you will never, ever forgive yourself. I had been calling Sarah, my ex-wife, for 3 days straight. I tried her cell, then the landline. Then I sent a barrage of texts watching them deliver, but never turned to read. That wasn't like her. Sarah always answered, even when our marriage imploded, even when we were sitting across from lawyers signing the divorce papers, even when she looked me in the eye and told me she'd met someone else, a man who was going to move into the house I was still paying the mortgage on. Even through all that bitterness, she always picked up the phone. Because Chloe was the bridge between us, and for Chloe's sake, we both tried to play the part of rational adults. I was flying down the interstate, aggressively trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. I told myself Sarah had dropped her phone in the sink, or they took a spontaneous trip to her mother's cabin up north, where the cell towers don't reach. I kept chanting these boring, rational explanations in my head, promising myself that in an hour I'd be laughing at my own panic. But my palms were sweating against the leather of the steering wheel, and I had to keep wiping them on my jeans. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about a memory I had been actively suppressing for 6 months. Chloe had said something incredibly strange to me on a FaceTime call. I had asked her how things were going, and she answered brightly. Too brightly. It was that specific. Artificial cheerfulness kids use when someone they are terrified of is standing just out of frame. She told me they had a giant new dog cage in the backyard, but they didn't have a dog. I had chuckled, figuring it was just a weird kid observation, and said they were probably going to adopt a puppy soon. Chloe went dead silent for a full second, and then quietly said, "Yeah, probably." That single second of silence, that microscopic sinkhole in the conversation where something massive and dark was hiding. I missed it, or rather, I let it slide. Because letting it slide was convenient. Acknowledging it would mean asking questions, and asking questions would mean starting another war with Sarah, and I was so goddamn tired of fighting with Sarah. But as I tore down the highway, the weight of that 1-second pause suddenly felt heavier than every argument Sarah and I had ever had. The house was in a quiet, suburban subdivision on the edge of town, hidden behind a towering corrugated steel privacy fence. Victor, Sarah's new husband, had put it up almost the exact week he moved his boxes in. Before him, it was just a standard wooden picket fence, the kind where neighbors lean over with a cup of coffee and gossip on Sunday mornings. Victor tore it down and replaced it with a sheer wall the color of wet asphalt, completely blinding the yard from the street. I didn't think much of it at the time. A man has a right to build a fence. A man has a right to his privacy. God, I couldn't tell you how many times I repeated that mantra to myself to avoid asking the obvious question, why does a normal guy need to hide his lawn from the rest of the world? I pulled up to the driveway and laid my thumb on the intercom button. Nothing. I pressed it again, holding it down for a solid 10 seconds. Faintly through the heavy walls, I could hear the digital chime echoing inside. Nobody came. Victor's SUV was parked in the driveway. I could see the grill of it through the sliver of space between the gate and the concrete pillar. It was a slate gray tank of a car that he bought using Sarah's money, even though she swore up and down they paid for it together. I started pounding on the metal gate with my fist, then the flat of my hand. Then I started hammering it so violently the steel reverberated like a gong, setting off a dog barking 2 houses down. Still, nobody opened the door. I backed away from the gate and looked up at the second-story windows. Every single curtain was drawn tight. It was the middle of the afternoon, the dead heat of summer, the kind of day where normal people throw their windows wide open to catch a breeze. But this house was sealed shut, suffocated like a tin can. And that was the exact moment I stopped trying to talk myself down. The property to the right belonged to an older woman named Martha. She lived alone and had a reputation for knowing the business of every single person on that street. I walked over to her side gate and it pushed right open. Martha never bothered with locks. I called out her name and she stepped out onto her back porch. She was wearing a faded housecoat and her face was pulled tight with anxiety. She looked at me like she had been waiting for someone to show up, like she had been waiting a long time. She looked me dead in the eye and told me it was a damn good thing I finally got here. She told me she had dialed 911 3 separate times over the last month, and every single time dispatch gave her the same tired script. It's a domestic dispute, ma'am. Let them sort it out. Unless there's an immediate visible threat to life, we can't send a cruiser. She told me she used to hear screams coming from the house late at night. At first, it was a woman's voice. And then abruptly, the screaming stopped. And she told me the silence was infinitely worse because the quiet that follows a scream isn't peace. It's something else entirely. She said she had watched Victor drag heavy black contractor bags out into the yard in the dead of night, tossing them directly into the swimming pool. And then she told me she hadn't seen my little girl, my Chloe, playing in the yard for over a week. I stood there, listening to her, and I felt a physical switch flip in the base of my skull. 60 seconds ago, I was just a stressed-out dad trying to pick up his kid for the weekend. Now I was something entirely different. I asked Martha if I could cut through her yard to get to the adjoining fence, and she didn't say a word. She just pointed a shaking finger toward a narrow dirt path running alongside her rose bushes. The partition fence between their yards was lower than the fortress facing the street. I hoisted myself up, tearing the skin off both palms on the rough steel edge, and dropped down into grass that was almost knee-high. Sarah used to be obsessed with the lawn. She paid a guy to edge it every Thursday, keeping it looking like a putting green. Now the backyard looked like it had been abandoned for years. Thick weeds were choking the stone pavers. The wooden swing set I had built for Chloe with my own 2 hands was leaning sideways, the chains red with rust. The little inflatable wading pool had been replaced by a massive above-ground frame pool. The water inside was a sickly, opaque green covered in a thick layer of film. It smelled heavy, stagnant, wrong, but I barely registered it because that's when I saw the cage. It was pushed up against the fence, half swallowed by the shadows of a plastic awning. It was a heavy-duty steel enclosure meant for a Rottweiler or a Shepherd, secured with a thick padlock. And inside that cage, curled into a tight little ball on a piece of filthy, stained blanket, was my daughter, my Chloe, 8 years old. Her hair was a matted bird's nest caked with gray dust. She was wearing the exact same sundress she had on during our FaceTime call 2 weeks ago. Only now the bright yellow fabric was stained brown and gray. Her lips were bone white and cracked down the middle. And on her wrist, her tiny fragile wrists, were deep, angry red trenches left by the wire someone had used to bind her before locking her inside. My vision actually went dark at the edges. It was a physical sensation, like someone had grabbed a dial and turned the brightness of the sun down to zero. I threw myself at the cage and ripped at the padlock. It didn't give an inch. It was an industrial lock, the kind of hardware you buy to secure a commercial warehouse, not a dog crate holding a child. Chloe slowly lifted her head and looked at me. There were no tears in her eyes. The tears had dried up a long time ago. All that was left in her expression was a quiet, hollow, terribly adult submission. It was an expression no 8-year-old should ever possess. It looked like she had gotten used to this, like this was simply the way the world worked now. She didn't scream for help. She just looked at me and whispered one word, "Dad." She said it flatly, like she was just checking to see if I was a hallucination. I spun around frantically and spotted a pile of rusted gardening tools leaning against the siding of the house. I grabbed a pair of heavy-duty lopping shears, the ones with the long steel handles meant for thick tree branches, wedged the blades right against the shackle of the padlock, and put my entire body weight into it. My hands were shaking so violently, I slipped and smashed my knuckles twice. On the third try, the metal shackle gave a sickening crunch, and the lock tumbled into the dead grass. I ripped the metal door open, and Chloe practically crawled out, latching onto my arm with both hands. Her fingernails dug into my skin so hard they broke the surface, but I didn't feel an ounce of pain. I couldn't feel anything except the frantic, bird-like fluttering of her heart hammering against my chest. She weighed nothing. She felt hollowed out, terrifyingly light for a kid who just 2 weeks ago was giggling into an iPhone camera and showing me a drawing of a cat. I scooped her up into my arms and turned toward the gate to get to my truck. And that's when Chloe suddenly went rigid. Her head snapped toward the above-ground pool. I followed her gaze, and she must have felt my chest shift because she dug her fingers into me even harder. She leaned into my neck and whispered so faintly I could barely catch the words over the wind. "Dad, just don't look in the pool. Please, let's just go. Just drive." I froze in my tracks. The murky green water caught the afternoon sunlight, and just beneath the surface, something massive and dark was suspended in the deep end. It was shapeless, heavy, and completely motionless. Chloe buried her face in my shoulder and started chanting, fast and breathless like a prayer. "Don't, don't, don't, don't." I didn't look. I carried her straight to the truck, put her in the back seat, buckled her in, locked every single door, pulled my phone from my pocket, and dialed 911. And this time, unlike when Martha called, I spoke with a voice so cold and absolute that the dispatcher stopped running through her script and just listened in dead silence. I set the phone face down on the hood of my truck and stared up at the house. Every curtain on the second floor was pulled tight, except one. In the narrowest slit between the heavy blackout fabric and the window frame, I saw movement. A shadow shifted. Someone was standing up there looking down at me. Someone had been inside that house the entire time. While I was beating my fist bloody against the steel gate, while I was scaling the neighbor's fence, while I was taking a pair of shears to a padlock to free my starving child from a cage, someone stood behind that glass and watched. And that someone knew I was coming, and they didn't open the door. They didn't let the kid out, and they didn't even try to wash the sins off their hands. The curtain twitched once, and then went perfectly still. I opened the truck door, climbed into the back seat next to Chloe, and wrapped my hand around hers. She looked up at me with those dry, ancient eyes, and spoke in a voice that belonged to a stranger, a voice that had been stripped of all its childhood. He said, "Liars live like dogs," she stated completely monotone. "But I'm not a liar, Dad. I just wanted you to come pick me up earlier. I've wanted you to come for a really, really long time." I could hear the wail of sirens bleeding into the neighborhood, but I wasn't looking at the road. My eyes were locked on that second-story window, and I knew with absolute certainty that the man standing behind that curtain could hear the sirens too, and that right in this exact second, he was making a choice. The first cruiser skidded to a halt in front of the driveway exactly 12 minutes later. I know the exact time because I was staring at the digital clock on my dash, and every single one of those 12 minutes felt like a standalone eternity sitting in the sweltering cab of the truck, holding my daughter's filthy hand, refusing to blink as I stared at the glass. The curtain never moved again, but I knew he was still there. You can feel a gaze like that. It's the same way you can feel someone staring at the back of your neck in a pitch-black room. Two cops got out of the cruiser. One was a young rookie in uniform who immediately unclipped his radio and started walking the perimeter of the fence. The other was an older woman in plainclothes. She had a sharp bob haircut and the kind of tired, calculating eyes that have seen the worst of humanity and stopped being surprised by it. She walked straight up to my window, leaned down, and took a long, hard look at Chloe before turning her eyes to me. She flashed a badge and introduced herself as Detective Russo. She gave me her first name too, but all my brain could process was Russo. She told me to walk her through it from the beginning, so I did. I told her about the unanswered calls, the steel gate, the dog crate, what Chloe had whispered to me in the shadow behind the second-story glass. Detective Russo didn't interrupt. She didn't pull out a notepad. She just listened. When I finally ran out of words, she shifted her gaze back to Chloe. She asked her in a voice that was gentle, but entirely free of that fake baby talk adults use, if she was in any physical pain. Chloe slowly shook her head. Then Russo asked her how long she had been locked in the cage. Chloe stared at the dashboard for a moment, thinking, and then said she didn't know for sure. Because when you're in the box, the days stop looking different from each other. But she said she knew for a fact it was at least 3 nights because she had counted the stars. And on the third night, the clouds rolled in and covered the sky, so there was nothing left to count. And she said that was the worst part. Detective Russo slowly stood up straight, and I saw a muscle in her jaw feather. Just a microscopic twitch, gone in a fraction of a second, but I saw it. She gave a sharp nod to the rookie, and he immediately keyed his shoulder mic and started calling for backup. Within 90 seconds, the atmosphere completely shifted. This wasn't a wellness check anymore. This was a breach. Russo told me to stay in the truck with my daughter. I started to argue I wanted to go in there with them, but she hit me with a look so heavy it shut my mouth instantly. She said the kid needed her father right now, and the police needed to clear a hostile structure without civilians in the crossfire. She used that word, civilians, and it dropped between us like a concrete wall separating my world from the nightmare playing out on the other side of that steel fence. The rookie popped the gate lock with a pry bar in about 3 seconds flat, and they moved in. I could hear them hammering on the heavy oak front door. Then the voices escalated. Someone barked, "Police department, open the door." A few seconds of dead air followed by the sickening, splintering crack of a doorframe giving way. They had kicked it in. Chloe didn't even flinch. She sat perfectly rigid on the bench seat like a tiny tin soldier, staring straight ahead at nothing at all. I popped the glove box, grabbed a plastic bottle of water, cracked the seal, and held it to her lips. She attacked it. She drank so fast she started choking. The water overflowed, running down her chin and soaking into the grime on her dress. I just held the plastic bottle, watching my little girl drink like she had been wandering the Mojave Desert. And the horrifying realization hit me she had been. There was no water dish in that crate, no bottle, no bucket, just iron bars, a rotting blanket, and a padlock. I pulled the empty bottle away and asked her gently, "Chloe, where's Mom?" She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched so long I thought she had blocked the question out entirely. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was flat, devoid of any pitch or emotion. She said Mom had been gone for a long time. She said Victor told her Mom packed her bags in the middle of the night and drove away because she was sick of them. But Chloe said she heard Mom screaming that night, not the kind of screaming when they fought over the bills, a different kind. And then the scream just snapped off, and the house got really quiet. Victor walked out of the master bedroom, locked the door behind him with a key, and told Chloe that Mom was just sleeping. And the next morning he told her Mom had moved away. I sat there listening to this, and I realized I had stopped breathing. Not metaphorically, my lungs had literally locked up. My chest was a vice, and I had to roll down the truck window and force myself to gasp for air before I could even look at my daughter again. Chloe was staring at me, waiting for me to say something. And in her dead, exhausted eyes, I saw the question she wasn't asking out loud. A question I could read as clearly as if she had screamed it in my face. Why didn't you come sooner? The rookie cop came stumbling out of the front door. He was moving fast, almost a jog, and all the color had completely drained from his face. He looked like ash. He walked past my truck without making eye contact, keyed his radio, and I caught fragments of the dispatch. Large amounts of dried maroon substance, spanning multiple rooms. We need crime scene out here right now. Detective Russo walked out a minute later. She moved slower, her steps heavy, wearing an expression I can only describe as the look of someone who has just witnessed a scene that 2 decades on the force couldn't prepare them for. She walked over to my window and spoke in a voice so tightly controlled it sounded robotic. She told me the house was empty. Victor was gone. He likely slipped out the back sliding door while we were bottlenecked at the front gate, but he had left behind a house where blood evidence wasn't just confined to one room. It was in the master bedroom, down the hallway, on the hardwood stairs, in the kitchen, smeared across the linoleum under the refrigerator, like someone had frantically tried to mop it up with bleach and failed miserably. She asked me for the exact date and time I had last spoken to Sarah, and she clarified actually heard her living voice, not just received a text message. I racked my brain and a cold dread washed over me when I realized I couldn't pinpoint the exact day the text stopped sounding like my ex-wife. Then Russo asked me about the pool. She said Chloe had mentioned it and she needed to know why a dehydrated child was so terrified of a source of water. I told her exactly what Chloe had whispered in my ear. Russo gave a grim nod, turned on her heel, and walked straight back toward the backyard. I sat in the cab of that sweltering truck, feeling time warp and stretch into another eternity. 10 minutes later, Russo reappeared. She was carrying a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside it was a heavy-duty black contractor trash bag, the kind you use for construction debris. It had been slit open down the middle. She opened the passenger door, sat down heavily on the seat next to me, and placed the bag on her lap. She looked at me and said the dive team wasn't here yet, but they had dragged the shallow end. They found several of these bags resting on the bottom, weighed down with landscaping rocks. They hadn't found a body, but what they did find inside those bags was, psychologically speaking, almost worse. She held the plastic up so I could see inside. Sarah's entire life was in there. Her driver's license, her passport, her health insurance cards. Chloe's original birth certificate, the one with the raised seal, not a copy. Sarah's iPhone, the screen spiderweb with cracks. Her keychain with the house in car fobs. And a wedding ring, but not the massive diamond Victor had bought her. It was the thin, modest gold band I had bought her with my very first real paycheck out of college. The one I assumed she had thrown in the river years ago. She had kept it. Through all the lawyers, the screaming matches, the divorce, she had kept my ring. Detective Russo looked at the bag and said that whoever packed this and threw it in the water wasn't just trying to hide a body. They were trying to erase a human being. Without an ID, Sarah couldn't check into a motel. She couldn't board a plane. She couldn't even walk into a police station and prove she was who she said she was. He had methodically severed her from the outside world long before the night Chloe heard the screaming. I reached out and traced the outline of the gold band through the thick plastic of the evidence bag. It was small, smooth. I remembered sliding it onto her finger at the altar, and how she laughed because I had gotten the sizing wrong and it kept slipping around. She ended up wearing it on her middle finger instead of her ring finger, joking that it was closer to a major vein that ran to her heart. It was biologically inaccurate, but we both pretended it was true. And back then, that kind of stupid romantic logic felt like it would last forever. I pulled my hand back and glanced in the rearview mirror at Chloe. She was staring blankly at the black trash bag over the center console. Her expression didn't shift a millimeter. Because she already knew. She knew exactly what was rotting at the bottom of that pool. She had watched Victor drag those bags out there. Maybe she had been standing at that upstairs window, watching him systematically incinerate every piece of evidence that her mother ever existed, knowing she was next on the list. Maybe that's why she begged me not to look in the water. Not because she was afraid of the gore I might see, but because she was terrified of the truth I would finally understand. Rousseau stepped out of the truck and put her phone to her ear. Through the cracked window, I could hear her barking orders. She was giving Victor's full legal name, his license plates, putting out a statewide APB. She rattled off his height, his weight, his eye color, and as I listened to her build his profile, a sickening realization washed over me. I barely knew the man who was raising my daughter. I had shaken his hand maybe 3 or 4 times. He always had this bright, blinding smile. He had a firm grip. He called Chloe Princess. He told me, man to man, how blessed he felt that he and Sarah could build such a loving, blended family. And I swallowed every word of it. I bought the smile and the handshake because it was infinitely easier than digging into his past, because it let me off the hook. It let me believe my kid was safe, so I didn't have to do the hard work of being the primary protector. Martha, the neighbor, walked up to the edge of the police tape. She had walked all the way around the block in her housecoat and gardening clogs. She looked tiny and fragile, her hands shaking violently, but her voice was like tempered steel. She looked right at me and said she knew. She knew from day one that the man was a monster. She had watched him snap at Sarah in the driveway when he thought the street was empty. She had seen the dark purple thumbprints bruising Sarah's upper arms, bruises Sarah tried to hide under thick wool sweaters in the middle of a 90-degree July heat wave. Martha said she called the cops 3 times, and 3 times the badge on the phone told her that unless the victim filed a report, their hands were tied. Family matter, she spat the words out like they were poison. And then she locked eyes with me and said something that still echoes in my skull every single night when I close my eyes. I'm guilty too, son. Every last one of us is guilty. I heard the screams through the drywall, and you heard the silence through the phone. We both knew the devil was in that house, and we both sat on our hands until it was too damn late. She turned around and shuffled back down the sidewalk toward her empty house. I watched her go, and I couldn't open my mouth to defend myself, because she was right. She was absolutely, ruthlessly, unforgivably right. Russo walked back to the truck and told me the forensics team was pulling up, and that Chloe and I needed to follow her back to the precinct for an official statement. She said it with her professional armor back on, but as she opened the door to her cruiser, she paused and looked back at Chloe sitting in my truck. And for a split second, the mask slipped. In the detective's eyes, I saw a dark, heavy, simmering rage. The specific kind of rage that only belongs to a mother looking at a broken child. I trailed the police cruiser through town, keeping my eyes glued to its taillights. Chloe unbuckled, leaned over the center console, and wrapped her small, filthy hand around my wrist. She didn't say a word, and neither did I. The silence inside the cab was so dense that saying anything would have felt like a desecration. But halfway to the station, Chloe spoke. No build-up, no context, just a quiet observation into the void. He wasn't always a monster, Dad. Sometimes he bought me ice cream from the truck. Sometimes he took me to the park to feed the ducks. And that made it so much worse, because I never knew which version of him was going to wake up in the morning. When he was screaming, I knew how to hide. But when he was smiling, I just kept waiting for the trap to spring. I gripped the steering wheel, realizing that my 8-year-old daughter understood the mechanics of pure evil better than I had in my entire adult life. And that thought caused a pain in my chest so sharp I had to jerk the truck onto the shoulder of the road. I threw it in park and just sat there burying my face in the steering wheel, shaking uncontrollably. Chloe gently patted my shoulder with her dirt-stained hand. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered. "You came. You finally came." We made it to the precinct. Russo ushered us through the bullpen and into a small interview room that smelled like stale coffee and ozone. A paramedic came in, took Chloe's vitals, and officially documented the severe dehydration, the deep lacerations on her wrists, and the alarming weight loss. While he was shining a penlight in her eyes, my cell phone buzzed. Unknown number. Instinctively, I swiped to answer and held it to my ear. Nothing. No dial tone, no static. just the heavy, breathing silence of someone holding a phone to their mouth and waiting. 5 seconds later, a sharp click, and the line went dead. I held the screen up to Russo. She memorized the number, spun on her heel, and walked out. 10 minutes later, she walked back in wearing a face I was quickly learning to translate. New information, and it's bad. She closed the door and said the uniforms had popped the lock on Victor's garage. Tucked inside the glove box of a secondary car, they found 2 Greyhound bus tickets for a departure out of state tonight. 2 tickets, not one. One adult, one child. He was never planning to run alone. He was going to take Chloe with him. Russo looked me dead in the eyes and said, "If he had gotten her on that bus, you would have never seen her again." Never. I sat there letting that word sink into my bones. Never. It felt like a death sentence that had only been commuted because the wire in my chest had snapped 12 hours before his bus was scheduled to leave. Right as she said it, my phone vibrated in my hand. A text message from the same unknown number that had just called. I opened it, read it, and then read it 2 more times because my brain simply refused to process the syntax. It read, "You broke in and took my property, so I'm taking mine. You don't know where Sarah is, and you will never find her until you bring the girl back." I turned the phone around and showed it to Russo. She read the text, and her face turned to granite. She snatched the phone out of my hand, yelled a name into the hallway, and suddenly the room erupted into the kind of chaotic machinery you only see in movies. Cops sprinting, shouting for carrier pings, setting up a sting trace. Someone shoved a paper cup of water into my hands, and I realized I was trembling so violently the water was sloshing over the rim and soaking my jeans. Chloe was sitting in the corner of the room, wrapped in a scratchy gray police blanket drawing. A rookie had brought her a stack of printer paper and some crayons, and she was coloring with a frantic, silent intensity. It's what traumatized kids do when they have no other weapons left to defend themselves. I walked over and looked over her shoulder. She was drawing a house, but there was no massive steel fence. There was no dog crate in the yard, just 2 stick figures standing on a porch, and the front door was drawn wide open. She wasn't drawing what she remembered. She was drawing what she prayed for. Russo came back into the room a half hour later. The way she closed the door slowly using both hands to make sure the latch didn't click told me everything I needed to know. She sat down directly across from me, folded her hands on the metal table, and spoke in the exact cadence an oncologist uses to deliver a terminal diagnosis. Flat, measured, no pauses for the panic to seep in. They had traced the burner phone. It was registered under Victor's name, but it was a ghost line, a phone Sarah never knew existed, a phone he used to manage the dark parallel life he kept hidden behind his steel fence. The ping originated from the south side of town, right near the Greyhound terminal. But by the time SWAT rolled up on the location, the signal was already moving down the interstate. Victor was in the wind, and he was moving fast. He had pivoted. The bus tickets in the garage were Plan A, quietly take the kid and vanish into the heartland. I blew that plan to hell when I broke the padlock. Now he was running solo. He wasn't on a bus. He had either hijacked a car or had a getaway vehicle stashed. Russo told me the state police had initiated a dragnet. Every way station, toll booth, and county line was heavily monitored. His mugshot was flashing on every dashboard computer in the tri-state area. She sounded confident, and God knows I wanted to believe her, but I could hear the slight tremor underneath her words, a splinter of doubt she couldn't quite swallow. I looked her in the eye and asked the question I was terrified to ask. What else did forensics find in the house? She hesitated. She glanced over at Chloe, who was furiously coloring the roof of her paper house, and jerked her head toward the hallway. We stepped outside. Russo leaned her back against the cinder block wall and stared at the fluorescent lights for a long time. She looked exhausted. Not the kind of tired that comes from missing sleep, but the soul-deep erosion of a person who spends their life wading through the sewage of human nature. Finally, she spoke. They found a ledger in his office, not a diary, a thick, spiral-bound accounting notebook filled front to back in tiny, meticulous handwriting. He logged everything by date and time like a CPA balancing a spreadsheet. Except he wasn't tracking money. He was tracking every single thing he did to Sarah and your daughter. Every act of abuse was documented, justified, and categorized. Every punishment had a neatly articulated thesis attached to it. It read like a training manual for breaking a wild horse. Sarah rolled her eyes, locked in the guest room for 24 hours. Sarah attempted to call her sister. Cell phone privileges revoked. Sarah refused a direct order. Physical correction administered. He didn't use the word beating. He used the phrase behavioral correction. And that, Russo said, was the most chilling part. He didn't look in the mirror and see a psychopath. He looked in the mirror and saw a strict, loving father keeping his house in order. The final pages of the ledger were entirely focused on Chloe. Victor had written that the child was becoming unmanageable, that she was a liar attempting to sow discord. The lies he was referring to were the coded messages Chloe had tried to slip me over the phone. She was too terrified to ask for help directly, so she dropped those bizarre breadcrumbs I had dismissed as childish imagination. The dog cage with no dog. Mom sleeps all day. Victor says we're going on a long trip soon. Victor caught every single one of those hints. Because he had tapped the house phone and was listening in on the second line every time I called. And every time I hung up, Chloe paid the price. The very last entry in the notebook stopped mid-sentence, like he had been interrupted, or maybe he just ran out of things to document because by that point, Sarah was no longer breathing inside that house. I stood in the hallway of the precinct and the linoleum floor started to pitch and roll like the deck of a ship. Russo grabbed my shoulder and forced me down onto a wooden bench. I stared at my hands and asked her point blank, "Is Sarah dead?" Russo said they didn't know. The dive team hadn't found a body in the pool. The blood swabs from the house were still at the lab, and until they had DNA confirmation, she couldn't legally tell me anything. But then she broke protocol. She told me something she absolutely wasn't supposed to say, probably because she saw my soul leaving my body. The volume of blood we found in the hallway, it looks catastrophic, but head wounds bleed like a stuck pig. People survive them. I'm not offering you false hope, Andrew. I'm just giving you the forensic reality. I walked back into the room. Chloe put her crayon down the second the door clicked shut. She looked at me waiting. I sat down across from her and she asked, "Did they find Mom?" I told her they were looking everywhere. She gave a slow, solemn nod, looking like a 40-year-old woman trapped in a child's body. Then she leaned forward and whispered that she had a secret. Something she hadn't told the police yet because she needed to tell me first. She said on that final night when she heard the screaming, she wasn't in her bed. The noise had woken her up. She crept down the hallway and hid behind the doorframe of the master bedroom. Peeking through the crack near the hinges, she saw Victor standing over her mother. Sarah was crumpled on the hardwood floor. Chloe said Mom wasn't moving, but she was still breathing because her chest was shuddering up and down. Victor scooped Sarah up, dumped her onto the mattress, and walked out of the room. Chloe scrambled backward and dove behind a heavy oak bookshelf in the hall. Victor walked right past her hiding spot. Chloe said he smelled like copper, like old pennies. She knew the smell because she had sucked on a paper cut once, and it tasted exactly like that. Victor went into the guest bathroom, locked the door, and turned the shower on. The water ran for a long time, maybe an hour. When he finally stepped out, he walked straight to Chloe's bedroom and pushed the door open. Chloe wasn't in bed. She was still curled into a ball behind the bookshelf in the dark. And Victor stopped in the hallway, looked into the pitch-black shadows, and said in a perfectly calm voice, "I know you're awake, Chloe. Get into bed. We'll discuss this in the morning." She army crawled back to her room and lay paralyzed under her covers until the sun came up. The next morning, Victor made pancakes and told her Mom had moved out. He said it with the casual boredom of a man remarking on the weather. And Chloe knew with the primal instinct of prey that if she ever contradicted his story, she would end up just like her mother. So she swallowed the terror and stayed silent. She stayed silent for days, watching Victor scrub the baseboards with bleach, watching him strip the bloody sheets, watching him drag those heavy black bags out to the pool. She stayed silent when he handed her the phone and stood over her while she told me everything was fine. She tried so hard to be the perfect, obedient little girl, because obedience was the only armor she had left. But eventually the dam broke and she slipped me that one desperate clue about the empty cage. And Victor heard it. I sat in that sterile police interrogation room, staring at the daughter I had failed to protect. The air between us was so thick with grief, it felt like breathing water. She recounted the entire nightmare in a dead, monotone voice. No tears. And that was infinitely worse than hysterics. Because when a child can recount a horror story without crying, it means they have crossed a psychological threshold where they realize crying won't save them. Russo knocked on the glass and asked if she could speak with Chloe alone. By law, interviewing a minor required a child psychologist present, and the specialist had just arrived. I nodded. Russo gently led Chloe into the adjoining room, leaving me completely alone. It was a claustrophobic box of a room. One window covered in steel mesh, a fluorescent tube light that buzzed like an angry wasp, a half-empty cup of cold coffee on the metal table. And pinned to the corkboard on the wall was a calendar featuring pictures of kittens in woven baskets. It was aggressively, absurdly out of place in a room where people confessed to the darkest atrocities of their lives. I stared at the kittens and my mind flashed back to the last time I saw Victor. He had bought me a beer and spent 20 minutes passionately talking about wanting to adopt a rescue kitten for Chloe. He had sounded so incredibly warm, so deeply invested in her happiness. I remember driving home that night thinking, maybe he's exactly what she needs. Maybe she's better off with a guy who has the energy to be a dad while I'm grinding 80-hour weeks and coming home too exhausted to read her a bedtime story. Maybe he's filling the gaps I left behind. And that is the ultimate trick of the devil. Monsters don't kick your front door down wielding an axe. They knock politely. They bring ice cream and rescue kittens. They charm their way inside, wait until you're comfortable, and then they quietly change the locks and build a 10-foot steel fence. And by the time the outside world realizes the house has become a slaughterhouse, there is no one left inside with the strength to scream for help. The heavy metal door clicked open and Russo walked back in. Alone. The psychologist was still with Chloe. Russo dropped into the metal chair across from me, and the dead silence stretched for a long time. Whatever she had just heard through the two-way glass had carved new deep lines into her face. Finally, she sighed and said Chloe had remembered one more detail. Victor didn't run out the back door when I started pounding on the gate. He was standing in the front foyer the whole time, looking through the peephole. He watched me circle the perimeter. He watched me scale the neighbor's fence. He stood at the master bedroom window and looked down as I found the dog crate and fought the padlock with the garden shears. And he never made a move to stop me. I stared at her, uncomprehending. Why? Russo's voice dropped an octave. She said Chloe saw him standing at the glass looking down at the yard, and he was smiling. He was smiling because me showing up wasn't an interruption. It was the final phase of his plan. He wanted me to find her in the cage. He wanted me to see the horror show Find the Bags in the Pool and dial 911 in a blind panic. Because he knew that while the cops were swarming the property, treating my daughter and dragging the water, he would have a clean, chaotic window to slip away unnoticed. And once he was miles down the highway, safe and untraceable, he would deploy his leverage. Give me the kid, and I'll tell you where Sarah's body is. That's what the text message meant. He wasn't bluffing. He was initiating a hostage negotiation. A cold sweat broke out across my back, soaking my shirt. The room was stiflingly hot, but I was freezing. I looked at Russo and asked her what our next move was. She didn't answer immediately. She pulled her phone from her blazer pocket, checked a notification, slid it back and leaned over the table. If he's trying to broker a trade, she said quietly, it means he has collateral. And a corpse is not collateral. A corpse is just a murder charge waiting to happen. You don't trade a dead body for a living child. You trade a living hostage. It hit me like a freight train. He didn't kill her. He hid her. And then Russo dropped the hammer. She said the crime scene techs had ripped Victor's garage apart. Along with the bus tickets, they found a standalone Garmin GPS unit shoved under the passenger seat of his spare car. He either forgot it in his rush or didn't think the cops would find it in time. The tech pulled the route history. There was a single unnamed waypoint saved in the system, just raw longitude and latitude coordinates. It pinged to a densely wooded area deep in the county miles off the main highway. A tactical unit was already en route. I gripped the edge of the metal table so hard my knuckles popped. I begged her to let me ride along. Russo shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. You are a civilian and you are a father. Your kid is sitting in the next room traumatized out of her mind. Your job right now is to hold her hand, not kick down doors in the woods. So I stayed. I picked Chloe up from the psychologist, brought her back into the room with the kitten calendar, and we sat. And we waited. Chloe went back to her crayons. I stared out the barred window as the afternoon sun bled into a bruised purple autumn dusk, counting the seconds. Without looking up from her drawing, Chloe casually mentioned that Victor used to brag about his IQ. He constantly told Sarah he was smarter than her, smarter than the local cops, smarter than anyone in the room. He needed to say it out loud, over and over, to convince himself it was true. And one night Sarah finally answered him. She whispered it so softly Victor couldn't hear it from the hallway, but Chloe was standing right there. Sarah had whispered, "Smart people aren't afraid of open doors." Chloe went silent and focused on shading the grass on her paper. I sat there letting Sarah's words echo in my mind. Even in the deepest pits of the hell her life had become, she still found the spine to speak the truth, even if it was just a whisper. She wasn't saying it to defy Victor. She was saying it to plant a seed in her daughter's mind. A tiny seed of rebellion that might eventually grow stronger than the terror. Out in the bullpen, Russo's desk phone rang. I heard her pick it up. The entire precinct seemed to go dead silent. A minute later, the heavy metal door swung open. Russo stood in the frame. Her face was entirely different. It wasn't joyful, and it wasn't exactly relieved, but the gray exhaustion had vanished. For the first time in 12 hours, she looked alive. She looked right at me and said 2 words. Found her, alive. Then she gave me the rundown. The coordinates led to an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the pines. Sarah was locked inside. She was severely dehydrated, suffering from blunt force trauma, but she was conscious. They were loading her into a medevac chopper right now. Rousseau said the paramedics asked her name, and she managed to croak out her name and Chloe's name before she finally let go and passed out on the stretcher. I tried to stand up, but my knees buckled. I just hit the floor. Chloe put her crayons down, walked over, and placed her tiny hand on the top of my head. In that moment, she was the parent and I was the child. She looked down at me and said, "I knew Mom was tough. She promised me." I didn't ask what the promise was. Not then, not ever. Because some vows only exist between a mother and her daughter in the dark. A father doesn't need to know the words. He just needs to know the promise was kept. I was pulling myself off the floor when Russo delivered the final piece of the puzzle. The piece that instantly vaporized any sense of relief I had. The highway patrol had boxed Victor's stolen car in at the county line. They popped the trunk and found a duffel bag stuffed with Sarah's winter clothes and a hunting knife. He didn't put up a fight. He didn't run. He just put his hands on the steering wheel, smiled at the troopers with his hands behind his back, and politely asked them to pass a message along to me. Tell Andrew the conversation isn't over. There are certain phrases that don't contain a single curse word, no explicit threats, no raised voices, but they freeze the blood in your veins anyway, because they are spoken by a predator who knows exactly how the game is played. The conversation isn't over. 5 polite conversational words, like a corporate middle manager rescheduling a Zoom meeting. And that absolute psychopathic calm is what terrified me the most. Normal people scream when they get arrested. They cry. They deny everything. They beg for a lawyer. Victor just smiled and passed along his regards. Russo had to get back to the bullpen, leaving me and Chloe alone in the room. Outside the barred window, the sky went pitch black. The fluorescent light above us buzzed louder and louder, like it was screaming in protest of the endless day. Chloe curled up into a tight ball on the plastic waiting room chair, pulling her knees to her chin. I draped the scratchy institutional blanket over her. It smelled heavily of cheap industrial laundry detergent. And right then, that harsh, chemical smell was the most comforting scent in the world. It was normal. It was bureaucratic. It meant we were safe in a world of rules. Chloe wasn't asleep. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. Her lips were moving silently, forming words without breath, like she was reciting an invisible mantra just to keep her sanity tethered to the earth. I pulled a chair up next to her and rested my heavy hand on the crown of her head. She didn't flinch. She just leaned into my palm like a freezing animal seeking out a radiator. An hour later, the door creaked open. A plainclothes detective I hadn't seen before walked in. He flashed a badge and mumbled his name and rank, but my brain refused to record the information. My eyes were locked entirely on the thick manila folder tucked under his arm. He sat down across from me, popped the clasp on the folder, and started dealing 8 by 10 glossy photographs across the metal table like a deck of tarot cards. He told me he needed official, visual identification. They were photos of Sarah's belongings, the items they had fished out of the black contractor bags at the bottom of the pool. Only now they were laid out on sterile, white backgrounds, tagged with bright yellow evidence markers. Her passport, her cracked iPhone, her key ring, the thin gold wedding band. I stared at them, my stomach churning, and nodded at each one. Yes, that's hers. That's hers. The detective scribbled my confirmation on a legal pad, then reached back into the manila folder. He pulled out one final plastic evidence bag that had been hidden at the bottom of the stack. Inside the bag was a photograph, a real physical Polaroid. The edges were bent, and one corner was severely creased. It was a picture of me and Sarah from a decade ago. We were standing on a beach in Florida. We looked so goddamn young. Sarah was pregnant with Chloe, standing sideways to show off the bump, throwing her head back in a massive, open-mouthed laugh. I had my arms wrapped around her waist from behind, grinning like an idiot. Our shoulders were sunburned, our hair was wet with salt water, and the ocean behind us was a brilliant, blinding blue. We were so fiercely happy. We had no idea how violent and twisted the road from that sunny beach to this bleak interrogation room was going to be. The detective cleared his throat. He said the crime scene techs didn't find this photo in the pool. They found it in the master bedroom, jammed deep underneath the heavy mattress, shoved all the way into the darkest corner against the bed frame. You had to practically dislocate your shoulder to reach it. Sarah had hidden it there, in a blind spot where Victor's obsessive, controlling eyes would never think to look. She had hoarded the memory of us. She hid the proof of her past happiness like it was a brick of heroin, like it was illegal contraband. Because in the house that Victor built, the house I used to walk into carrying a diaper bag and a bouquet of grocery store flowers, remembering that life used to be beautiful, was a crime punishable by violence. I picked up the plastic evidence bag with shaking hands and stared at our sunburned faces through the plastic. I had to consciously force my fist to relax so I didn't crush the photo. Because this wasn't evidence of a crime, it was evidence of a miracle. It proved that right up until the bitter end, until the night Victor beat her into a coma and threw her in the trunk of a car, Sarah never lost herself. He took her passport, her phone, her car keys, her voice, and her freedom. But he couldn't take this photo because he didn't know it existed. And in that one tiny, desperate act of defiance, shoving a piece of glossy paper under a mattress, Sarah possessed infinitely more power than Victor ever had with his fists and his psychotic little ledger. The detective packed up his files and left. I sat there holding the baggie, thinking about Sarah lying unconscious in an ICU bed across town. I thought about how easily I had let her walk out of my life, how quickly I had stepped aside and let another man take the wheel. I kept telling myself, she's an adult, she made her own choices. But the guilt didn't care about logic. Guilt is like floodwater. It seeps into the microscopic cracks in your soul and fills up spaces it has no right being in. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was Rousseau. She told me Victor had been processed and thrown in holding, and that his formal interrogation was scheduled for first thing in the morning. She said the arresting officers were deeply rattled by him. During the entire ride back to the precinct, he sat in the cage of the cruiser and made polite small talk. He asked the cops how their shifts were going. He cracked a joke about the local sports team. The troopers said it made their skin crawl, because a man who was just caught fleeing the state with his half-dead wife's bloody clothes in his trunk shouldn't act like he's catching a cab to the airport. I swallowed hard and asked if I could go to the hospital to see Sarah. Russo sighed. She said Sarah was out of surgery and in the ICU. She was stabilized but critical, and the attending physician had put a hard lock on all visitors. Then Russo's voice softened. She said right before Sarah went under the anesthesia, she grabbed a nurse's scrubs, pulled her close, and whispered one sentence. "It's all my fault. I chose him." Russo repeated the quote, and then the line went dead silent. A heavy, suffocating silence, just like the water in that pool. I realized Russo wasn't pausing for dramatic effect. She was pausing because she had heard those exact words from battered women 1,000 times in her career. And every time she heard it, it chipped away a piece of her soul she knew she was never getting back. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't the hardened detective talking. It was just a woman, a mother. "No woman actively chooses her own executioner, Andrew," she said quietly. "She chooses the man who shows her the absolute best version of himself. The executioner only shows up months later after the deadbolts are thrown and the curtains are drawn." I hung up the phone and looked over at Chloe. She had finally collapsed into sleep, curled tightly in the plastic chair, clutching the drawing of the house with the open door to her chest. In sleep, the hard, ancient mask she had been wearing all day finally melted away. Her face softened. Her mouth fell open slightly, and her tangled hair spilled over her eyes. She looked like my little girl again. I realized the terrifying composure she had shown all day, the ability to recount horrors without shedding a single tear answering police questions, like a seasoned lawyer, was purely a survival mechanism. It was armor, but underneath it, she was just an exhausted, starving, terrified 8-year-old kid who just wanted her dad to show up. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I sat guard in the hard plastic chair, watching her chest rise and fall. Every breath she took looked so incredibly fragile, like a blown glass ornament that would shatter if the wind blew too hard. Just before dawn, she twitched violently in her sleep and whimpered, "Don't!" I instantly reached out and pressed my heavy palm flat against her back. The warmth grounded her, and her breathing leveled out. I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood to keep from sobbing out loud. Because I knew this wasn't the first time she had cried out in her sleep. She had whimpered that exact word every single night in that steel cage, and nobody was there to put a hand on her back. Nobody was there to anchor her. She fell asleep in the dark, and she woke up in the dark. The word "don't" was the only weapon she had against the monsters. The sun came up, and Russo walked into the room. She looked like she had gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight. She handed me a paper cup of black diner coffee without saying a word. Once I took a sip, she gave me the morning briefing. 3 things had happened overnight, and I needed to brace myself for all of them. First, Sarah had been downgraded from critical and moved out of the ICU to a standard room. She woke up lucid and gave her official statement to a veteran detective. She corroborated every horrific detail Chloe had given us and added a few more of her own. Russo said the detective who took the statement, a guy with 25 years on the homicide desk, had to stop the tape, walk out into the hallway, and take 5 minutes to compose himself before he could go back in. Second, Victor had officially waived his right to an attorney. He sat in the interrogation room, stared directly into the camera, and talked for 3 solid hours. He didn't deny a single charge. He didn't plead the fifth. He explained his actions. He spoke in a calm, professorial tone, explaining to the detectives that Sarah was a difficult, combative woman who refused to understand her role in the household. He claimed Chloe had inherited her mother's defiant streak and that strict physical boundaries were absolutely essential for the child's psychological development. He used the phrase psychological development to justify locking a starving child in a dog crate. And not once in 3 hours did his heart rate spike. He never raised his voice. He never shed a tear of remorse. The lead detective finally slammed his hands on the table and asked Victor if he had any concept of the sheer amount of prison time he was facing. Victor just smiled his blinding smile and said he trusted the jury system. He said every story has two sides, and once the public heard his side, they would completely understand. I watched Russo's knuckles turn white around her coffee cup as she told me this. The cheap cardboard actually started to buckle under her grip. She said she had interrogated every breed of monster on earth. The ones who scream and throw chairs. The ones who weep and beg God for forgiveness. The ones who stare at the wall in catatonic silence. But Victor was a different species entirely. He was the most dangerous kind of evil, the man who doesn't think he's playing the villain. He genuinely believed he was a righteous man, and he was mildly annoyed that the police couldn't see his brilliance. Third, and this was the one that made me want to put my fist through the cinder block wall. The detectives had canvassed Victor's workplace. They interviewed his boss and the guys on his construction crew. Every single one of them gave the exact same glowing review. Stellar employee, the first guy to help you move a couch, always smiling, the life of the party. The site foreman, a guy who had drank beers with Victor for 3 years, looked right into the police camera and said, "I don't buy it. It has to be a misunderstanding. The guy worships his stepdaughter. I've literally watched him buy her expensive dresses on his lunch break. His eyes light up when he talks about her." That was the detail that broke my brain. The foreman watched Victor buy pretty floral dresses for Chloe with a smile on his face. Mere hours before he went home, threw that same little girl into a steel cage and twisted industrial wire around her wrists until they bled. It was a duality so sickening I couldn't comprehend it. It made me question the foundation of human nature. Russo finished her coffee, crushed the cup in her fist, and tossed it into the trash can. Then she looked at me with deep pity in her eyes. "Sarah has requested that you do not bring Chloe to the hospital. She doesn't want to see her." I blinked stunned. "Not yet," Russo clarified quickly. "She isn't ready. She said she cannot bear the thought of her daughter looking at her face right now." Russo told me it was a textbook trauma response. Victims of severe domestic violence often isolate themselves from the people they love the most in the immediate aftermath. The shame of being a victim is a heavier burden than the physical pain. It overrides a mother's instinct to hold her child. Sarah just needed time. I asked if I could go see her alone. Russo nodded and said she would clear it with the floor nurses. Chloe finally woke up when a uniform brought in a styrofoam tray of precinct breakfast. Watery oatmeal and a piece of dry toast. She ate it with excruciating slowness. She took tiny, cautious bites, her eyes constantly darting toward the door, like she fully expected someone to kick it open and snatch the food away. I couldn't watch it. I had to turn my body toward the wall. Then I'd look back, and my heart would shatter all over again. That is how a child eats when they have been tortured for experiencing basic human needs. When taking a sip of water or closing your eyes to sleep is a punishable offense, your brain rewires itself. Eating becomes a high-risk operation. When she finished the toast, I knelt down in front of her. I told her the police found Mom. I told her Mom was in a safe hospital bed, and the doctors were making her better. Chloe looked at me with those ancient eyes and asked, "Can we go get her?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and lied. I said Mom was sleeping, and the doctors said she needed a few days of total quiet to heal. Chloe lowered her eyes and gave a single nod. I knew instantly that she didn't believe me. She didn't think I was lying about the hospital, but her brain simply couldn't comprehend the concept of healing or resting. In the universe she had lived in for the last month, the word rest did not exist. Russo drove us to the hospital. A child life specialist took Chloe to the cafeteria for ice cream, and I took the elevator up to the surgical ward. Long, sterile hallways. The sharp smell of bleach and iodine. The squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. A floor nurse stopped me outside room 412. She told me the patient was strictly no visitors, but the detectives had authorized me. She put a hand on my arm and whispered, Brace yourself before you walk in there. I pushed the heavy door open. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the mattress, her back to the window. The afternoon sun was entirely behind her, throwing her face into deep shadow. But I didn't need to see the bruises to understand the damage. I saw it in her posture. She was hunched over, her shoulders pulled tight to her ears, her arms wrapped around her ribs. She looked like she was actively trying to shrink, trying to take up the absolute minimum amount of space in the universe so nobody would notice her. She slowly turned her head and the light hit her face. I am not going to describe the specifics of what Victor did to her. Some horrors do not deserve to be immortalized in words. They just need to be understood. I will only say this. I was looking at the face of a woman I had slept next to for 7 years. The woman who gave birth to my child. And for 2 agonizing seconds, I genuinely did not recognize her. She looked at me through swollen purple slits and spoke in a raspy, grating voice that sounded like it belonged to a 90-year-old chain smoker. You shouldn't have come. I didn't want you to see this. I didn't say a word. I pulled the plastic visitor's chair right up to the edge of the bed, sat down and just looked at her. And we sat there in the hum of the heart monitor, 2 people who used to laugh until our ribs hurt on a sunny beach, entirely unaware that life had the capacity to beat you down until you were unrecognizable to the person who loved you most. Then she broke the silence. She repeated the exact phrase she had told the paramedics and the exact phrase she had told the detective. But this time she was saying it to me, and the weight of the words was crushing. This is my fault, Drew. All of it. I picked him. I brought that monster into my house and I handed him our little girl. I did this. I leaned forward, rested my elbows on my knees, and finally spoke. I parroted Detective Russo's wisdom, but I translated it into my own vocabulary. Because clinical psychology doesn't mean a damn thing when someone is drowning in their own guilt. I told her she didn't choose a monster. She chose a charming guy with a good job who brought her flowers. The monster picked the lock and snuck in later. I told her the only person responsible for throwing a punch is the coward swinging the fist. And then I told her the only thing that mattered in the entire world. Chloe is alive. You are alive. He lost. Sarah stared at her hands. No tears. How is she? She whispered. I told her Chloe was the strongest person I had ever met. I told her about the drawing of the house with the open door. I told her Chloe was waiting for her. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Sarah cried. She didn't sob or wail. It was totally silent. Thick, heavy tears just spilled over her swollen eyelids and tracked down her bruised cheeks. She didn't reach up to wipe them away, and I didn't offer her a tissue. Because those tears weren't a breakdown. They were a baptism. They were the very first step on the long, brutal road back to being a human being. The trial was set for late autumn. The months between the rescue and the courtroom were a blur of emotions I don't have the vocabulary to properly describe. It was a chaotic cocktail of profound relief, suffocating anxiety, crushing guilt, and a white-hot homicidal rage. These emotions didn't take turns. They lived inside my chest all at once, fighting for dominance. They kept me awake until 3 a.m., and they dragged me out of bed at 4 a.m. to go stand in the doorway of Chloe's bedroom just to watch her chest rise and fall, to make sure the blankets were tucked in, to make sure her bedroom door was wide open. Because Chloe could no longer sleep with a closed door. I won full custody in an emergency hearing. The family court judge took one look at the police file, slammed his gavel, and gave me sole, physical, and legal guardianship in under 10 minutes. I drove my truck over to Victor's house to pack up Chloe's room. I didn't bring boxes. I only took the things she specifically asked for. It ended up being one single grocery bag, 2 fairy tale books, a ratty plush rabbit missing its left ear that she called Barnaby, and a tin of colored pencils. She didn't want anything else. She told me the rest of her toys smelled like the bad house. I didn't ask her to elaborate. I understood exactly what she meant. Those first few months living together were agonizing. And not because Chloe was throwing tantrums or acting out. It was the exact opposite. She was terrifyingly, unnervingly obedient. She asked for permission to exist. Dad, am I allowed to open the fridge for water? Dad, is it okay if I turn the hallway light on? Dad, am I allowed to sit on the couch? Every time she asked one of those questions, a fresh crack formed in my heart. Because I knew the dark math behind them. She had been conditioned by a psychopath. In Victor's house, taking a sip of water without clearance resulted in a beating. She had learned to be a ghost, to be completely silent, to take up zero space, to never be an inconvenience. And now my entire purpose in life was to systematically dismantle that programming. I had to teach my 8-year-old daughter that she owned the house, that she could rip the fridge open at 2 a.m. if she wanted to, that she was allowed to belly laugh at the TV, that she was allowed to look me in the eye and scream, "No!" at the top of her lungs, and that I would still love her just the same. The trauma specialist Chloe saw twice a week warned me it was going to be a marathon, not a sprint. She said trauma isn't a straight line. There would be regressions, bad days, night terrors, panic attacks triggered by the most mundane things. She wasn't exaggerating. One Tuesday evening, I was making spaghetti and accidentally knocked a heavy stainless steel pot off the counter. It hit the tile floor with a deafening crash. I cursed, picked it up, and walked out to the living room to tell Chloe dinner was almost ready. I found her pressed flat against the hallway wall. Her face was chalk white. Her pupils were dilated so wide, her eyes looked black, and both of her hands were raised in front of her face, like a boxer protecting against a blow. It took me 15 solid minutes to talk her down. 15 minutes of sitting cross-legged on the floor, 6 feet away from her, speaking in a low, rhythmic whisper. I didn't dare touch her. In that state of hyper-arousal, a hug feels like an assault. I just kept repeating, "It was a pot, kiddo. Just a clumsy dad dropping a pot. You're safe. I'm here. You're safe." Sarah spent 2 months in an inpatient physical and psychiatric rehab facility. Chloe and I drove out to see her every Sunday afternoon. Those first few visits were excruciating. Sarah still couldn't look Chloe in the eyes. She stared at the floor tiles, paralyzed by a toxic cocktail of shame and guilt. Chloe absorbed that rejection, and a thick, invisible wall of ice built up between them. Sarah had lost 40 pounds, chopped her hair off into a ragged pixie cut, and wore heavy, long-sleeve flannel shirts, even when the thermostat was set to 75. I knew exactly what she was hiding under those sleeves. Chloe knew too. We all played the game of pretending we didn't notice. But healing is like watching a glacier move. You don't see it happening in real time, but one day you look up and the landscape has completely changed. It happened in millimeters. One Sunday, Sarah finally lifted her chin and held Chloe's gaze without flinching. The next week, Chloe told a joke she heard at school, and Sarah let out a genuine, raspy laugh. It was brief, but it sounded like church bells ringing after a 10-year war. A month later, Sarah reached across the plastic cafeteria table and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind Chloe's ear. Chloe didn't shrink away. She leaned into her mother's palm. They sat like that for 5 unbroken minutes, neither of them speaking a word. And the silence wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind anymore. It was the warm, golden silence of a wound finally closing. The criminal trial kicked off in November. The courtroom was packed, even though the judge had heavily restricted public access. Detective Russo was sitting right behind the prosecutor's table, wearing a sharp navy suit, holding the exact same manila folder she had on day one. Martha, the neighbor, was sitting in the second row, wearing her Sunday best, sitting ramrod straight. When she walked past my aisle, she reached out and squeezed my shoulder with her bony hand. She didn't say a word, but the grip communicated everything. "I'm here. We're finishing this." The bailiff brought Victor out. It was the first time I had laid eyes on him since I broke the padlock on the dog crate, and it made me sick to my stomach. He looked fantastic. He was clean-shaven, his hair was perfectly styled, and he was wearing a tailored dress shirt his defense team had provided. He walked into the courtroom with a swagger, scanned the gallery, gave a polite nod to the deputies like they were valets at a country club, sat down at the defense table, and smiled. It wasn't a cartoonish villain smirk. It was a warm, charismatic, aw shucks smile. The kind of smile that makes you instantly trust a guy selling you a used car. If you walked in off the street and knew nothing about the case, you would look at Victor and assume he was a prominent local businessman fighting a bogus tax evasion charge. The district attorney stood up and began reading the indictment. It took 10 minutes. Every single charge landed like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil, and Victor's charming smile never wavered. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, aggravated child abuse, systematic domestic battery, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, the list went on and on. And behind every single legal term was a night of screaming, a pool of blood, and a starving child staring at the stars through steel bars. The prosecution called their witnesses. Martha took the stand and testified about the muffled screams and the useless 911 calls. Her voice shook, but she stared daggers at Victor the entire time. The ER trauma surgeon meticulously documented the catalog of broken bones and malnutrition Sarah and Chloe had suffered. The child psychologist took the stand, adjusted her glasses, and read a single sentence from her evaluation that I will never, ever forget. The minor victim exhibits the exact psychological and behavioral adaptations commonly observed in long-term prisoners of war and victims of hostage situations. Hostage. My little girl wasn't just abused, she was a prisoner of war in a suburban cul-de-sac. And then the defense took over, and the surreal nightmare truly began. Victor had fired his expensive private lawyer and was utilizing a public defender, but he was essentially directing his own defense. They called his co-workers to the stand to read his character references. Excellent foreman, generous friend, the life of the party. Every single word of those testimonies was a documented fact, and every single word was a profound, catastrophic lie. And inside the chasm between that truth and that lie is where abusers thrive. The site manager, the guy who had watched Victor buy the floral dresses, testified that Victor was a model family man and openly questioned the validity of the police timeline. I sat in the hard wooden pew listening to this man defend a monster, and I had a terrifying epiphany. Evil does not wear a name tag. The devil doesn't show up with horns and a pitchfork. He shows up with a firm handshake, a winning smile, and a shopping bag full of expensive gifts for your kid. And you invite him right into your living room because he looks exactly like a savior. Sarah was the final witness. She walked down the center aisle slowly leaning heavily on a cane, never once looking in Victor's direction. She took the oath, sat down, and leaned into the microphone. She spoke in a voice so quiet and steady that the entire courtroom held its collective breath. You could hear the hum of the HVAC system over her words. She dismantled his illusion piece by piece. She explained how the abuse didn't start with a punch. It started with care. You look tired, honey. Let me handle the finances. Then the care morphed into isolation. Your sister is toxic. You shouldn't text her anymore. Why do you need a cell phone? I'm always with you. Then the isolation weaponized into violence. The first time he hit her, he immediately broke down sobbing, begging on his knees for forgiveness. The second time he hit her, he bought her jewelry and blamed the stress of work. The third time he hit her, he calmly explained why it was her fault for provoking him. By the fourth time, he just hit her and walked away, because the training period was over. She recounted the final night, the argument, the blinding flash of pain, waking up in the pitch-black trunk of a moving car gagging on the metallic taste of her own blood. She described the abandoned hunting cabin in the woods, how he chained her to a rusted plumbing pipe and left a single-gallon jug of water just out of her reach. He didn't want her dead. A dead wife is a murder investigation. A missing wife is leverage. When Sarah finished, the judge asked the defense if they had any cross-examination. Victor stood up. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Sarah. He turned around, scanned the gallery, and locked eyes directly with me. There was no hatred in his stare, no fear, just the cold, arrogant superiority of a man who genuinely believed he was the smartest person in the room. "You aren't a perfect father, Andrew," Victor said, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. "If you were half the man you pretend to be, you never would have handed her over to me in the first place." He sat back down. I didn't lunge over the railing. I didn't scream at him. Not because I had incredible self-control, but because his words hit me like a sniper bullet. He was right. That was the most devastating part of his sociopathic game. He used a sliver of the truth to twist the knife. I wasn't a perfect father. I had missed the red flags. I had ignored the weird vibe on FaceTime. I had allowed my resentment towards Sarah to blind me to the danger my daughter was in. I wanted an easy life, so I convinced myself there was no problem. But it took me months of intense therapy to finally process the second half of that equation. A flawed, distracted father is a human being making mistakes. A man who locks a starving child in a dog crate is a demon. They do not exist in the same moral universe. Learning to separate the guilt I genuinely owned from the toxic guilt a psychopath was trying to infect me with was the hardest psychological war I've ever fought. The verdict was swift, and the sentencing was merciless. When the judge read the final tally, consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, Victor didn't even blink. He tilted his head slightly, like a man listening to a mildly annoying weather forecast. The bailiffs slapped the cuffs on him and led him through the side door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in 6 months, I exhaled. I exhaled so deeply, I felt my rib cage expand to its absolute limit, cracking joints that had been clenched tight since the second I saw that steel cage in the grass. As I walked out onto the courthouse steps, Detective Russo fell into step beside me. She reached into her blazer and handed me a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was the dog-eared Polaroid of me and Sarah on the beach. She told me the appeals window had closed on that specific piece of evidence, and the DA had cleared it for release. I took the bag. Russo gave my hand one firm, professional shake, turned up her collar against the autumn wind, and walked away without looking back. Time kept moving. Sarah eventually checked out of the rehab center. We didn't get back together, and we never will. The bridge between us didn't just burn, it was vaporized. There is simply too much trauma, too much history, and too much darkness to ever go back to being husband and wife. But we achieved something much rarer. We learned how to be co-parents. We stopped being the exes and became a unified front, bonded by the absolute necessity of keeping our daughter safe. Sarah rented a modest, sun-drenched apartment on the north side of town. Big bay windows, no heavy curtains, and absolutely no fences in the yard. Chloe packs a duffel bag every other weekend to go stay with her. She always packs Barnaby, the one-eared rabbit, and her tin of colored pencils. She draws constantly now, but the pictures have changed. She uses bright yellows, deep blues, vibrant greens. The grim charcoal gray stick figures from the police station are gone. A few weeks ago, I was standing at the kitchen sink scrubbing a frying pan. Chloe was sitting at the island coloring a picture of a dragon. Out of nowhere, without lifting her eyes from the paper, she asked in a totally casual, breezy voice, "Hey, Dad, are we ever going to get a swimming pool in the backyard?" I froze. I slowly set the soapy sponge down, dried my hands on a dish towel, walked around the island, and looked her dead in the eye. "No, kiddo, never." Chloe gave a satisfied little nod like I had just confirmed the sky was blue, and went right back to shading the dragon's wings. That night, when I tucked her into bed, she asked me to leave the bedroom door open. I told her I always do. She slid down under the covers, pulled them right up to her chin, tucked Barnaby under her arm, and closed her eyes. I stood in the doorframe watching her. Her breathing was deep and rhythmic. She didn't flinch. She didn't whimper, "Don't!" into the shadows. She didn't throw her hands up to block an invisible blow. Just as I was about to walk away, her eyes fluttered open. "Dad," she whispered, "can you leave the front door unlocked tonight?" Every protective instinct in my body screamed at me to say no. I wanted to tell her that deadbolts keep us safe, that locking the world out is how we survive. But I looked at my little girl. I looked at the kid who spent 3 agonizing nights locked behind an industrial padlock, staring at the sky and wondering if she was going to die in a cage. And I swallowed my own fear. "Yeah, kiddo," I said softly. "I'll leave it unlocked." She smiled, closed her eyes, and was asleep in 60 seconds. I walked out into the living room and stared at the heavy oak front door. Then I looked over at the stainless steel refrigerator. Pinned right in the center, held up by a magnet, was the drawing from the precinct. The house with no fence, no cage, 2 people, and a door thrown wide open. I walked over to the front door, wrapped my hand around the brass deadbolt, and twisted it to the left. The heavy metal cylinder clicked back into the door. Unlocked. I knew I was going to lock it again the next morning. I'm not an idiot. The real world requires locks and security systems. True safety doesn't come from an open door. But for tonight, for this one specific night, my daughter needed to know that she was not a prisoner. She needed to know that if she wanted to, she could turn the knob and walk out into the grass. She needed to know she was completely, unconditionally free. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the hardwood floor in the dark hallway of my quiet safe house. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I buried my face in my hands and cried. I didn't cry out of grief, and I didn't cry out of joy. I cried from a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. I cried because we survived, because the door was unlocked, because tomorrow was going to happen and the day after that. And every single day was going to be a fraction of a millimeter easier than the last. Not because the trauma disappears. It never disappears. You just learn how to build a bigger house around it. The pain stops taking up the entire room, and eventually you realize you have space to breathe again. Down the hall, Chloe took a deep, uninterrupted breath. Outside the window, the wind rustled the oak trees. The sun was going to come up soon. Listen to me. The story I just told you, it isn't a movie script. It's the terrifying reality hiding behind perfectly manicured lawns and solid steel privacy fences all over this country. Behind the brightest, most charismatic smiles, there are horrors playing out that you cannot even fathom. If your gut is telling you something is wrong with a neighbor, a friend, or a family member, do not ignore it. Do not be the person who hears the screams through the drywall and writes it off as a family matter. Because sometimes a single phone call, a relentless knock on the door, or a pair of bolt cutters is the only thing standing between a child and the abyss. If this story hits you hard, if you're still sitting here with me at the very end, drop a comment below. I read them all, and I need to know this message is getting out there. Hit the like button. The algorithm pushes it to more people, and maybe it reaches someone who desperately needs a wake-up call today. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep sitting around this fire together. And please share this with the people you love. Sometimes hearing one story is all it takes to change someone's entire trajectory. Thanks for staying with me, right to the bitter end. Stay safe out there. The chilling narrative of a child trapped behind a high fence and locked in a cage serves as a profound wake-up call about the dangers of look-away culture and the critical importance of human connection. From a personal standpoint, this story teaches us that true safety is never built on isolation, and appearance is often a deceptive mask for cruelty. We frequently convince ourselves that minimizing conflict or respecting private boundaries is the polite choice. Yet this narrative reveals that looking away out of comfort can make us silent accomplices to tragedy. It reminds us that evil does not always arrive with a scowl. It often enters our lives with a polite handshake, a bright smile, and the calculated warmth of a savior. To build a genuinely better, more humanistic life, we must cultivate the courage to listen through the silences of those we love and pay attention to the unspoken gaps in our conversations. We must fiercely reject the dangerous bystander phrase, "It's a family matter," when the safety of a vulnerable soul is on the line. True maturity lies not in avoiding difficult confrontations, but in taking active responsibility for the well-being of our children and our communities. Ultimately, the story highlights that healing is a long, fragile journey, where the simple act of keeping a door unlocked can restore a sense of freedom. By choosing active awareness over passive convenience, we can transform our shared world into a sanctuary where no child has to count the stars through the bars of a cage just to survive. The commentary and analytical reflections provided above are strictly intended for educational, humanistic, and awareness-raising purposes. This content is designed to stimulate critical thinking regarding personal awareness, emotional responsibility, and community vigilance. It does not constitute legal, psychological, or professional child welfare advice, and personal perspectives shared do not reflect certified expert counseling.